The title of this video is Understanding Cholesterol, the greatest medical hoax of all time, and still ongoing. You'd think that the actual truth and explanations of cholesterol, artery plaque, atherosclerosis, statin use, you'd think, based on the fact that most of the medical community today is still giving the advice, statins for everybody, low-fat diet, you would think that nobody knows the correct answer except for a few doctors in our space that lecture about it. I wanted to see if that was true. We have AI today. We have Google. Now, we all know that basically that just regurgitates from the huge pool of information in their databases. Some true, some phony. I wondered what would happen if I sat down with Gemini, which is Google AI, on my cell phone and tried to figure this thing out. I was surprised. I think you'll be surprised too. And I think this will be enlightening, informative, clear, and easy to understand. And the big question at the end is, why aren't the doctors doing just what I did today? Why aren't they curious? So let's go. I'm going to show you a session on my cell phone between me and some very nice British accented young lady, which is the voice I chose to represent the Google AI. Buckle up. Okay, let's open up Gemini here. And let's help me learn. And let's ask it. Explain the difference between cholesterol and an LDL molecule.
While people often use cholesterol and LDL interchangeably, they actually play very different roles in your body. Let's break down the relationship between them. The cargo and the carrier. To understand the difference, imagine a shipping system. Cholesterol is the cargo. It is a waxy, fat-like substance that your body actually needs to build cell membranes, produce hormones like estrogen and testosterone, and make vitamin D. LDL, low-density lipoprotein, is the delivery truck. Since cholesterol is a fat, it cannot dissolve in your watery blood. To move around, it must be packed into tiny bubbles made of protein and fat called lipoproteins. Why LDL gets a bad reputation. I'll ask guiding questions along the way to help us dive deeper. To start, how would you like to explore this further? 1. The HDL connection. Learn about the good counterpart to LDL and how it acts like a cleanup crew for your arteries.
Is there such a thing as good and bad cholesterol?
In medical terms, people often talk about good and bad cholesterol, but the cholesterol molecule, C_27H_460 itself, is exactly the same in both cases.
Number 1, the plaque process.
To understand how plaque forms, we have to look at what happens when LDL particles linger too long in the bloodstream. It isn't just about having too much cholesterol, it's about a series of biological reactions within the walls of your arteries. 1. The entry and trapping. The process begins when LDL particles move from the blood into the lining of the artery wall, the endothelium. If the lining is damaged by things like high blood pressure, smoking, or high blood sugar, the LDL gets trapped inside the wall more easily. 2. Oxidation, the turning point. Once trapped, the LDL particle undergoes a chemical change called oxidation. This spoiled LDL is now recognized by the body as a foreign invader rather than a delivery vehicle. 3. The immune response. Your immune system sends white blood cells called monocytes to the site. These transform into macrophages, from the Greek for big eaters, and begin gobbling up the oxidized LDL, 4, foam cells and plaque. As the macrophages gorge themselves on cholesterol, they become heavy and yellowish. These are called foam cells. When enough foam cells accumulate, they form a fatty streak, the earliest stage of a plaque. Over time, the body covers this mess with a hard, fibrous cap to keep it contained, narrowing the artery. Since the macrophages are trying to help by cleaning up the LDL, why do you think their eating process ends up making the plaque bigger instead of clearing it away?
I don't know. Tell me why.
It's a bit of a tragic irony. The macrophages are actually too good at their jobs. When a macrophage encounters an oxidized LDL particle, it doesn't have a stop switch. It keeps consuming the spoiled fats until it is physically stuffed. At this point, several things go wrong that turn a helpful immune response into a growing problem. Inability to move. Once the macrophage becomes a foam cell, it gets heavy and loses its ability to crawl out of the artery wall. It becomes a permanent resident of the plaque, calling for backup. Feeling sick from all that fat, the foam cell releases chemical signals, cytokines, that act like a flare gun, calling even more white blood cells to the area. Cell death. Eventually, the foam cell dies. When it bursts, it spills all that processed cholesterol and toxic waste back into the artery wall, creating a necrotic core, a pool of dead tissue and fat. This cycle of call for backup, eat until you burst and spill the contents, is what causes the plaque to grow thicker and thicker over decades.
Tell me about the particle size factor.
The particle size factor refers to the idea that not all LDL particles are created equal. Even if two people have the same total LDL number on a blood test, their actual risk for heart disease might be very different based on the size and density of those particles. Think of your arteries like a fine mesh screen. If you try to throw objects at that screen, the size of those objects determines if they get stuck or pass through. The two main patterns. Scientists generally categorize LDL particles into two patterns. 1. Pattern A, large buoyant LDL. These are large fluffy particles. Because of their size, they tend to bounce off the artery walls and keep moving. They are considered less likely to get trapped and oxidize. 2. Pattern B, small, dense LDL. These are tiny, heavy particles. Because they are so small, they can easily slip into the gaps of the artery lining, the endothelium. Once inside, they are much more prone to oxidation, which triggers the immune response we discussed earlier. Why size matters. Easier penetration. Small particles can infiltrate the artery wall more effectively than large ones. Higher number. For the same total weight of cholesterol, a person with pattern B has many more individual particles circulating than someone with pattern A. More particles means more chances for one to get stuck. Stickiness. Small, dense LDL particles tend to bind more easily to the structures inside the artery wall, making them harder for the HDL cleanup crew to remove. This is why some modern blood tests look at ApoB or LDLP, particle count, rather than just the total weight of the cholesterol. Since these small, dense particles are the ones that most easily turn into foam cells, do you think having a high HDL level would be more or less important for someone who has mostly pattern B LDL?
Absolutely.
It is definitely more important. When someone has pattern B, small, dense LDL, they essentially have a fleet of tiny stealth particles that are much better at sneaking into the artery walls. Because these small particles are so prone to getting stuck and oxidizing, the cleanup role of HDL becomes critical. Think of it this way. If you have a high risk of trash, oxidized LDL, building up in your pipes, you need a much larger and more active sanitation crew, HDL, to keep things clear. The HDL Rescue Mission. HDL performs a process called reverse cholesterol transport. Here is how it helps specifically with those small, dense particles. Extraction, HDL can actually dock with a foam cell and pull the cholesterol out of it, potentially shrinking the fatty streak before it turns into a hard plaque. Antioxidation, HDL carries special enzymes that can help prevent LDL from oxidizing in the first place. It's like putting a protective coating on the LDL so it doesn't spoil. Anti-inflammation. It sends signals to the artery wall to calm down the immune response, preventing more monocytes from rushing in and making the situation worse. If someone has a lot of small LDL, pattern B, but low HDL, they are in a double jeopardy situation. They have a high rate of plaque formation and a very weak cleanup crew. Since we've seen that the type and count of particles matter as much as the total amount of cholesterol, how do you think a doctor might change their treatment plan if a patient has a high LDL number, but it's mostly the large, fluffy pattern A?
A low carbohydrate diet is said to be the best way to accomplish this.
That is a very popular and scientifically supported perspective. Many researchers and doctors have found that carbohydrate intake, specifically refined sugars and starches, has a direct impact on the size and density of those LDL particles. The carb-insulin connection: when you eat a high carbohydrate diet, your body produces more insulin. High insulin levels can trigger the liver to produce more triglycerides, blood fats. Here is the domino effect that leads to those dangerous pattern B particles. 1. Triglyceride spike. The liver pumps out VLDL, very low-density lipoprotein, packed with triglycerides. 2. Particle exchange. An enzyme in the blood swaps some of those triglycerides into your LDL particles. 3. Shrinkage. Another enzyme, hepatic lipase, then removes those triglycerides, leaving the LDL particle shrunken and more dense. This is how you get small, dense LDL, pattern B. The low-carb shift. By lowering carbohydrate intake, you typically lower your insulin and triglyceride levels. For many people, this causes a shift in their lipid profile. LDL size. Particles often shift from small and dense, pattern B, to large and fluffy, pattern A. Triglycerides. These usually drop significantly. HDL. This good cholesterol often increases, strengthening your cleanup crew. Interestingly, on a low-carb or ketogenic diet, a person's total LDL number might sometimes stay the same or even go up, but the quality of the particles and the overall ratio of HDL to triglycerides often improves. Since we've talked about how diet can change the trucks, the lipoproteins, do you want to look at how the body's address labels, like ApoB, help doctors get an even more accurate picture than a standard cholesterol test? 1. ApoB testing. Why many experts think this is the gold standard for measuring heart risk. 2. Inflammation markers. Looking at HSCRP to see if the fire of inflammation is actually present in the arteries. 3. The triglyceride/HDL ratio. A simple calculation you can do with a standard blood test to estimate your particle size.
Tell me about the triglyceride to HDL ratio.
While specialized tests like ApoB or LDLP provide the most detail, you can actually estimate your particle size pattern using a standard cholesterol panel by looking at the triglyceride/HDL ratio. Because high triglycerides are a major driver in shrinking LDL particles into that dangerous small and dense pattern B shape, this ratio is often a better predictor of heart risk than total LDL alone. How to calculate it? You simply divide your triglyceride number by your HDL number. What the numbers suggest: ideal, 2.0 or less. This usually indicates pattern A, large, fluffy LDL. It suggests your metabolism is handling carbohydrates well, and your cleanup crew, HDL, is strong. High risk, 4.0 or higher. This is a strong indicator of pattern B, small, dense LDL. It often points toward insulin resistance, where the liver is overproducing fats that crunch your LDL into smaller, stickier particles. Why low carb impacts this ratio? On a low carbohydrate diet, this ratio typically improves dramatically. When you reduce sugar and starch, your liver stops pumping out as many triglycerides. As those shrinking agents disappear from the blood, your LDL particles have room to expand back into their larger, safer pattern A shape. At the same time, HDL often rises because it is no longer being swapped out for fats. If you have a recent blood test handy without sharing any personal info, we could look at how those two numbers relate. Otherwise, which part of this lipid puzzle would you like to explore next? 1. The address label, ApoB. Why some doctors believe the number of particles matters more than the ratio. 2. Inflammation, HSCRP. How to tell if your body is actually reacting to the cholesterol in your blood. 3. The liver's role. How the liver decides how many delivery trucks to send out in the first place.
No, thank you. I think we understand what we need to know.
It sounds like you have a solid grasp of how the cholesterol molecule differs from the LDL transport vehicle and how factors like particle size and diet influence heart health. To recap our journey, the molecule versus the truck cholesterol is a vital building block for cells and hormones, while LDL and HDL are the delivery trucks that move it through the blood. The plaque process. Problems start when LDL gets trapped, oxidizes, and turns into foam cells, narrowing the arteries. Quality matters. Small, dense pattern B LDL is much more likely to cause plaque than large, fluffy pattern A. The power of diet. A low-carbohydrate approach can significantly improve your triglyceride/HDL ratio, shifting your particles toward that safer pattern A. If you ever want to dive back in to discuss other health topics or different biological processes, I'll be here to help. Great work exploring these complex concepts.
In all the propaganda and all the misinformation out there on Google, a few simple, logical questions get you right to the truth. A truth that we hear every day in our own community. It's not a secret. Somebody should teach the doctors how to use Google. But they don't have time. They're probably out playing golf. I could have gone on for days like this. I've been playing with this now for a couple of weeks. It's not hard to get to the reality of it. Unfortunately, the reality of it doesn't come with a paycheck. So they put their hands over their ears and concentrate on the golf ball. It's what we got. Anytime anybody tells you about cholesterol, good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, they're not talking about cholesterol. They're talking about the transport trucks, an analogy I've been using for years. Sometimes I call them FedEx trucks. The cholesterol is cholesterol. It is the cargo. It can neither be good or bad. We need, and it's very hard, we need to stop referring to the trucks as cholesterol. That's what we do. That's where the majority of the confusion comes in. Without cholesterol, we would not exist. Cholesterol is a necessary, absolutely necessary compound that's used in so many of the body's essential needs. It builds cell walls. It creates hormones. Without it, we'd be dead. And constantly trying to lower it by any means, pharmaceutical, to even think about it, it's harmful. I think the core problem, I think the one thing that kind of explains how we got here is the simple fact that with all the things the medical community seems to focus on, blame things on, question the patients, the one thing they never ask, what do you eat? When we know that that is the only path back from sickness to health. Change your diet. Meat heavy, 70% of your calories from fat, most of the rest from protein. It's that simple. Let me know when you hear that come out of your doctor's mouth. I think that's enough of that for today. I hope you found that informative. At least maybe it'll stimulate your curiosity. Open up Google and start talking. And choose the voice that you like to hear the best. Somewhere in England, it seems, there's a very, very, very smart young British lady that indeed does have all the answers if you know how to ask the right questions. Take the rest of the day off and eat meat.